Thank you, sir. Ooh. Well, there we go. Good morning. Got some Super Bowl fans out there this morning? Anybody? Yeah. Who's going for Joe Burrow and the Bengals? Yeah. Who's going for the other team? Who are they? The Rams. I got one Ram fan over here. All right, who cares? Could care less. Yeah, pretty much everybody else. Okay. Yeah, you know, this morning as I was thinking about the lesson and what we're going to be talking about this morning, I thought about the Trojan horse behind me. Most of you are familiar with that. It was a deception, if you will, by the Greeks after a 10-year-long siege to get into Troy. Some men had hidden inside of that wooden horse. And when they brought it in, when the lights went down and it got dark that night, a few of the men snuck out, opened up the gates, and Troy fell after a 10-year siege. A lesser-known deception took place back when I was in the 4th grade. I played for the Falcons there in Houston, Texas, and we were playing a football game. And many of you probably seen this before, but our coach had the idea, and he called this particular play. And so the offense walked up to the line of scrimmage. We were the Falcons, red and black. We run up to the line of scrimmage, and everybody's getting down. And our quarterback goes, wait, Mr. Referee, something's wrong with the ball. And so our center gave the ball to our quarterback, and he starts walking over to the referee saying something's wrong with the ball. And once he gets past everybody, he took off running for a touchdown. We won the game. Yeah, it's a true story. But, you know, maybe you've done that before, maybe you haven't. Another one, I'm going to give you another one, 2 different ones. In 2002, was playing paintball. Got any paintball players out there? No? Paintballs sting when you get hit, okay? So it was our youth group playing against the adults over in Forney, Texas, and there were roughly about 150 plus kids, some other youth groups out there playing against the adults. And there was this peninsula that went out into the water, and the adults were put on it, like a little island, and one way on and one way off, and the teenagers had us surrounded. And they were pelting us with paintballs, just one after the other, adults getting picked off left and right. Well, I was in my full camo, coveralls. And so I'm laying there. Now, when you get hit with a paintball, you're supposed to get up and walk out. I'm hit, and walk out, right? That's what you got to do. And so what I did is I'm laying on the side of the hill looking up and firing paintballs back at everybody. And then I decided, I got an idea. Because just past the water, which is about 5 rows deep from where we are, about where Jerry's at from the little peninsula I was on, there's a wall that the teenagers were hiding behind. So they were picking us off left and right. And so I decided to take my paintball gun, and you're supposed to put your plug in the end of it. Well, I held my plug here and my gun here, and I started walking like this. Because the kids had seen me pull my hamstring that day. And so I'm walking like this, and nobody's shooting at me. I just walk up, and when I got past the wall, I turned, and the kid goes, "Oh, no." And so we won the war there today. Anyway, it is what it is. But deceptions come in all different ways, right? And some are pretty big ruses, and some aren't. Well, this morning we're going to be in the book of Joshua, chapter 9, and we're going to see a ruse, a deception that gets used in that passage there. Now, so far in the book of Joshua, what we've seen is the Israelites have come into the land of Canaan. They, with God's power and might, took down Jericho. They went on to fight Ai, and when they got there, they messed up because there was sin in the camp, and they lost, and they were routed, and several men were killed. And then God talked to Joshua because Joshua was freaking out. He's laying on the ground saying, "Oh, God, why did you ever bring us across the river? Because now the people are going to find out about us that you're not with us anymore, and we're going to be defeated." And God says, "Get up off the ground. You got some things to fix. I'm still in control. We're going to win this. Come on, we got to make some things right." And they do. And so we get to chapter 9, beginning in verse 1 through 2. "Now, after when all the kings west of Jordan heard about these things, when they heard about Israel being routed, when they heard about the defeat that Israel suffered against Ai in the first attack, these kings of the hill country in the western foothills, along the entire coast of the Mediterranean Sea, as far as Lebanon, the kings of the Hittites, the Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites. They all came together to wage war against Joshua and Israel. Now I want to stop there for a minute because you'll notice that's a big difference from what Jericho had done. Jericho knew that Israel was coming in. Rahab says, we heard about your God and what God had done in Egypt, and we were afraid. Our hearts are melting with fear. And so they locked up. But after the men, women, of children of God were defeated in that battle, the attitude changes. The Canaanite kings begin to say, you know what? There is a chance. There's a kink in their armor, if you will. And so now, if we all get together, we can take them out. Now, here's the cool thing about this, right? They outnumbered God's people. God tells them in Deuteronomy chapter 7 that when you go into the land of the Canaan, you're going to face 7 kings and 7 kingdoms far larger than you. But don't worry about it. I've delivered them into your hands. So now you have these kings coming together, and their plan is not to hide behind walls, but to wage war and attack Israel. They're feeling pretty full of themselves right now. They were no longer afraid. That's what I want you to hear. They were no longer afraid, and they sought to destroy Israel. They weren't afraid of God. Yahweh, the God that Jericho was afraid of, Canaan no longer is. However, when the people of Gibeon heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and Ai, they resorted to a ruse or a deception, a plan. Now, one thing you need to know in this culture, one of the really things about that culture, to deceive someone, to get away with it, was seen kind of a badge of honor. If you could pull off a big plan and trick somebody from another country, you were seen as being pretty good at it. And so the people of Gibeon resorted to a ruse, and they went as a delegation whose donkeys were loaded with worn-out sacks and old wineskins, cracked and mended. They put worn and patched sandals on their feet and wore old clothes. All the bread of their food supply was dry and moldy. Then they went to Joshua in the camp at Gilgal and said to him and the Israelites, we have come from a distant country to make a treaty with us. So they have got old clothes, old patches, old wineskins, doing everything they can to make it look like they've been on a big, long journey. All right? And so the Israelites said to the Hivites, but perhaps you live near us. So how can we make a treaty with you? We are your servants, they said to Joshua. Now the idea is that we're not your slaves, we're your servants. You are a bigger, stronger army, and we recognize that you have something special about you. And so we're going to humble ourselves and acknowledge your greatness. But Joshua asked, who are you? And where do you come from? Why does Joshua even care where they come from? I mean, really? I mean, he's coming in to fight, and the people coming up. Well, Deuteronomy 20, 10 through 20, we're going to be reading here, tells us why it matters. When you march up to attack a city, this is God through Moses talking to the Israelites. When you march up to attack a city, make its people an offer of peace. If they accept it and open their gates, all the people in it shall subject to forced labor and shall work for you. If they refuse to make peace, they engage you in battle, lay siege to that city. When the Lord your God delivers it into your hand, put a sword to all the men in it. As for the women, the children, the livestock, and everything else in the city, you may take as a plunder for yourselves. And you may use the plunder that the Lord your God has given you from your enemies. This is how you are to treat all the cities that are a distance from you and do not belong to the nations nearby. However, if the cities of the nations the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, do not leave anything alive that breathes. Completely destroy them. That's the idea of the Hiram, the ban. Everything belongs to God. It is a holy war. Put everything to the sword, as you did in Jericho, as you did in Ai. Completely destroy them, the Hittites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, as the Lord your God has commanded you. Remember, they got in trouble at Ai because they didn't do what the Lord commanded. Otherwise, they will teach you to follow all the detestable things they do in worshiping their gods. And you will sin against the Lord your God. So God's given them a warning. Hey, if you don't do this, this is what's going to happen. This is what the result's going to be. So God says, look, there's offers of peace, and there's a command to destroy. Peace to those people who are from a far distance, who open up their gates and accept the treaty, and death to those who belong to the land of Canaan, those who are being punished, as God said he was going to do, of the Canaanite people. So Joshua has a reason to be asking, so who are you and where are you from? Because God has specifically given the command, don't make a treaty with anyone in the land that we're taking. Only with those from a far off distance. Now to us today, I know it's like that seems like 100 years ago. It was longer than that, right? And what's the connection to us today? Well, I hope by the time we're through this morning that you'll be able to take some things and apply it to your own life. At the end of the day, this is about God and his people. They answered, the Gibeonites answered, your servants have come from a very, very distant country because of the fame of the Lord your God. For we heard reports of him, all he did in Egypt, and all that he did to the two kings of the Amorites east of the Jordan, Sihon, king of Heshbon, and Og, king of Bashan, who reigned in Ashtaroth. Our elders and all those living in our country said to us, take provisions for the journey, go and meet them and say to them, we are your servants, make a treaty with us. So they have heard what God is doing, and rather than what the other kings are doing to wage war, they're trying to figure out a way to get around a war. They're wanting to make a peaceful treaty. They're looking for a way not to be killed. And so they've come up with this idea to take their donkeys and their clothes and their food and put it all together and make it look really like they've been traveling a long way. And they're acknowledging that God is God. And their leadership says, look, go ask them to make a treaty. This bread of ours in verse 12 was warm, and we packed it at home on the day we left to you. But now, see how dry and moldy it is? And these wineskins that filled were new, but see how cracked they are. And our clothes and our sandals are worn out by the very long journey. The Israelites sampled their provisions, but did not inquire of the Lord. That would be the Urim and Thummim. I always say it wrong, but the idea was the high priest had a vest with different jewels and things upon it. In a sack right about his heart, they had the Urim and the Thummim, and they would shake them and roll them, and that's how they made decisions. Only the high priest could do that. Because Moses was a mediator between God and man. Joshua was not. But the Israelites sampled their provisions. They're going over and checking it out. Yeah, your bread is moldy. Your shoes are worn out. Your clothes are messed up. Yeah, you look like you're telling the truth. You came on a long journey, because that's what we would expect to happen on a long journey. And then Joshua made a treaty of peace with them to let them live. And the leaders of the assembly ratified it by oath. Don't we get ourselves in trouble by not seeking, listening, and obeying God? God has so much wisdom for us. And you think by now the Israelites would have learned. You think Joshua and the leaders of Israel would have learned. But rather than seeking God, they went ahead and made a decision based on what they could see. And God had told them in Joshua chapter 1 and in several other places, do not depart from my word to the right or the left, and you will be successful in the land I'm giving you. You don't have to be afraid. You can be strong and be courageous if you do what I tell you to do. But a lot of times in my life, when I've gotten in the most trouble is when I've decided to do things my way. Or based on the information that I think I have all the information and I don't. It can get you in trouble when you do those things. And here we see in Proverbs 3, 5 through 6, to trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to Him, and He will make your path straight. I can't make my path straight. I don't know where to go. How was Joshua supposed to know? They weren't from a long way away. I mean, everything looked like it, right? All the signs were there. But there's a way that seems right to man, but in the end leads to death. You ever made a decision that you thought was the right one and it ended up costing you a relationship? Costing you a job? Or worse? 3 days after they made the treaty with the Gibeonites, the Israelites heard that they were neighbors living near them. Can you imagine what Joshua must have been feeling? Because here's the deal. They're walking with God daily. They have felt and known the presence of God from the time they walked out of Egypt, led by the fire and led by the pillar and with the ark going before them. God was in their midst. They knew what it was like to have a relationship with God. They also knew, because Moses didn't get to go in the promised land, what the consequences were of not doing things God's way. The desert, the wilderness, if you will, was full of their parents and their grandparents' bodies who didn't get to go into the promised land because they failed to listen to and obey God's plan and instructions. They failed to trust God. And I can only imagine that Joshua was sitting here going, uh-oh, what in the world? He heard that they were neighbors living near them, so the Israelites set out, and on the third day came to the cities of Gibeon, Kippra, Beeroth, and Kiriath-Jearim. But the Israelites did not attack them. Why? Because the leaders of the assembly had sworn an oath to them by the Lord, the God of Israel. The whole assembly grumbled against the leaders. Sometimes moms and dads, sometimes employers, coaches, sometimes leaders, you make a mistake. And the people that you serve and the people that you lead have every right in the world to hold you accountable. There were times in Israel's life when the people messed up and time when the leaders messed up. There is one God. I'm not him. You're not him. Moses wasn't him. Only God is perfect. And we make mistakes along the way. We're going to say and do things. We're going to make bad decisions, hasty decisions. Sometimes because we don't have enough information. Sometimes because we're just being selfish. Or we think we know it all. But in this case, the leaders are being grumbled against by the Israelite people. Why? Because they know what happens when you disobey God. But the leaders answered, we have given them an oath by the Lord, the God of Israel, and we cannot touch them now. You see, making oaths in that time meant a lot more than they do today. People walk out on contracts all the time, whether it's for rental of a house, an apartment, a TV, whether it's agreeing to $1 million contract to play sports for a team, whatever it is, marriage covenants. People walk out on contracts. Oaths don't mean as much to us today, to a lot of people, I should say. But an oath that was made in biblical times, oftentimes when it was broken, would lead to someone becoming a slave or being executed for breaking the oath. And this was not just about breaking an oath, it was obtaining the honor of God. They had made an oath not just in their name, but in God's name. That's one of the reasons why Jesus tells us to let your yes be yes and your no be no. So the leaders said, this is what we'll do to them. We will let them live so that God's wrath will not fall on us for breaking the oath we swore to them. They continued, let them live, but let them live be woodcutters and water carriers in the service of the whole assembly. So the leader's promise was kept. Then Joshua summoned the Gibeonites. Why did you deceive us by saying, we live a long way from you, while you actually live near us? You are now under a curse. You will never be released from your service as woodcutters and water carriers for the house of my God. You think Joshua doesn't already know the answer? You see, God had called him to destroy all people. The Gibeonites were just trying to stay alive. And chances are they went walking up to Joshua and said, hey, time out. You can't, no, we don't want this. We surrender. No. There was no surrender. If you're going to obey God, that meant that the Gibeonites, men, women, and children, were to be destroyed. So I think Joshua probably knew. A lot of times we know the answer before we ask the question, don't we? But wait for it. They answered Joshua, "Your servants were clearly told how the Lord your God had commanded his servant Moses to give you the whole land and wipe it out, all its inhabitants before you." They had heard the message. They knew destruction was coming. The same way Rahab knew destruction was coming upon Jericho. Rahab lied to her leaders. And in this instance, the Gibeonites lied to Joshua and the leaders of Israel, both wanting the same thing, to somehow, in the midst of annihilation, to find a life raft of safety, to have a pardon given to them. I find it interesting that the Gibeonites knew the Word of God. They knew to come from a long distance. I don't know whether that was by spies. I don't know whether that was by someone else. But they knew that they needed to pull a ruse that said they were not from around here. And when they came, they said, "We heard about what you did in Egypt. We heard about what you did to the kings on the other side of the Jordan." They didn't mention Jericho or Ai. Why? It would have shown that they were up close and knew what was happening, because that had just happened. They had come on a long journey. But God had clearly told them. And one of the things I want you to understand is that there is faith. There's faith in the Gibeonite response. So we feared for our lives because of you. And that is why we did this. We are now in your hands. Do to us whatever seems good and right to you. Now, a little stop and a pause. I want you to think back to Pentecost, when Peter stands up amongst everyone and says, "These men and women are not drunk as you suppose. They're just fulfilling what the prophet Joel had said." And then he begins to lay out the history of Israel and what they had done to the Messiah, the Anointed One, Jesus the Christ, how they had crucified Him, how their sin, how their arrogance, how their inability to recognize the Son of God had caused Jesus to die and had now left them under penalty of death themselves. At that point, they cry out, "What must we do?" They wanted to be saved, the same way the Gibeonites wanted to be saved. And there's only one way, and that's in and through Jesus the Christ. No, you can read that behind me. I want you to think about that. The pagan nation, the Gibeonites, who were also the Hivites and some Amorites, and descendant of Noah's son, Ham, Canaan, they believed the Word of God and acted on it to save their lives. It's not just believing the Word, it's acting on it. Joshua 10, 1 through 4, I think sometimes when I've read this story in the past, I almost look at the Gibeonites as being kind of some wimpy people, because everybody else is fighting while they coming up and doing all this little lying, trying to get out of it, going to submit themselves to service, right? So they must not be very strong. That couldn't be farther from the truth. Now Adonai-Zedek, king of Jerusalem, which will one day become the city of David, king of Jerusalem, heard that Joshua had taken Ai and totally destroyed it, doing to Ai as its king and his king as he had done to Jericho and its king, and that the people of Gibeon had made a treaty of peace with Israel and become their allies. He and his people were very much alarmed at this. Why? Because Gibeon was an important city, like one of the royal cities. It was larger than Ai, and all its men were good fighters or good warriors. These were people who were respected. This was like England getting America in World War II. This is like you and I getting to have Joe Burrow on our LSU football team. It made a difference, right? As a game changer. The Gibeonites now joining in with the Israelites make them even more formidable. But you notice he doesn't want to go attack the Israelites. Why? Because he knows he's going to lose. He's thinking, I might have a chance with them. And he rounds up all of his people. Adonai, king of Jerusalem, appealed to Hoham, king of Hebron, Piram, king of Jarmuth, Japhia, king of Lachish, and Debir, king of Eglon. Come up and help me attack Gibeon, he said, because it made peace with Joshua and the Israelites. So Joshua saved them from the Israelites, and they did not kill them. That day he made the Gibeonites woodcutters and water carriers for the assembly. And I want to stop there. You've seen that several times, woodcutters and water carriers. The reason you're seeing that, that's not the only jobs they had. All right? But a woodcutter was predominantly a man's job. And a water carrier was predominantly a female's position. And the idea is men and women alike of Gibeah are going to serve the nation of Israel for the rest of their lives. To provide for the needs of the altar of the Lord at the place the Lord would choose. And that is where they are to this day. Now I want to stop there for a minute. Who's supposed to work on the altar? Not the Gibeonites, the Levites. Joshua done messed up again. When you think about Gibeah, though, it is better is one day in your courts than 1,000 elsewhere. I would rather be a doorkeeper in the house of my God. I'd rather be a woodcutter or a water carrier in the house of my God than dwell in the tents of the wicked. You see, Gibeon understood their predicament. They were facing a holy God leading his people, his nation. And they had nothing but destruction to look forward to. They were desperate. Every single person in this room, including myself, we are going to die. There's no getting out of that. God's Word says that only those who are in Christ Jesus can have a hope of everlasting life with Him. And those outside of Christ, outside of His protection, are lost. That's truth. But the evil one and the spiritual forces of evil would come alongside us and bend our ear. Did God really say? Did God really say that immersion into the water and back up is what is needed? Did God really say that Jesus is the only way? Did God really mean that sex outside of marriage is wrong? Did God really mean that cheating on your husband or your wife is wrong? Did God really mean that gossip is wrong? Did God really mean that disobeying your parents is wrong? Did God really mean that racism and anger and rage is wrong and worthy of death? Absolutely. He did. And so the deception that goes on today is not the Gibeonites trying to deceive the Israelites. It's the evil one trying to deceive us. That God didn't mean what He said He meant. And the Israelites learned that the hard way. But as they learned, they matured. And as they matured, they became a stronger nation. As they became a stronger nation, they led and moved more and more into the land of Canaan. And they had their failures. But it was God who was given the victory. Kenneth Matthews says this: because of their service to the Lord at the tabernacle, they, the Gibeonites, live at the centerpiece of Israel's unity and worship. In other words, by grace, those initially outside the covenant are brought near to God. That's a powerful statement. You see, at the end of the day, mercy triumphs over judgment. God was merciful to Joshua and the Israelites because they messed up. But He gave them grace. God was merciful to Rahab because she acted in faith and acknowledged him as Yahweh. She acted on the word that she heard, and she believed that God is who he says he is. The Gibeonites had heard and received the word that God is the God of heaven above and on earth below, that he had defeated the Egyptians, that he had defeated the kings on the other side, that he had parted the Red Sea, that he had parted the Jordan, and sooner or later he was going to part them. And they made a decision to do the only way they knew how, is to try to make a treaty. Over the course of time, they began to know God more personally. And as you read the scriptures, you're going to see where Saul, King Saul, breaks the oath that was made with Gibeon. And as a result, 7 of his lineage were executed. They were handed over to Gibeon to be executed because the Israelites broke their oath. God is a God of grace and mercy does triumph over judgment for the truly repentant heart, for the one that has submitted their will to God's will. Those who seek God as the Gibeonites did find him. Regardless of the motivation that started with you, it brought them to God. And in coming to God, they found salvation. They found deliverance. And that same salvation, that same deliverance is available to you today as we stand and sing.